Have you ever found yourself, caught in that endless scroll on Netflix or whatever streaming service you use, convinced the perfect movie is just around the corner, but
Yeah.
you just can't actually hit play?
Oh, definitely. Or standing in a coffee shop.
Right, staring at the menu, eyes glazing over at like 100 different ways to customize your latte, and you start wondering why picking a simple drink suddenly feels like this huge life decision.
It's true. Even something totally mundane.
Exactly. Like picking out toothpaste. You walk into the aisle and suddenly you're just paralyzed by 40 different options. Each one promises something slightly different, whiter teeth, fresher breath, you name it.
Hmm.
And we're taught, right? Our
Yeah.
culture absolutely reinforces this idea that choice itself is inherently good. More options mean more freedom, more autonomy, more chance to get exactly what we want. That's the assumption, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
The dominant belief.
What if that seemingly endless buffet of options isn't actually liberating us? What if instead it's making us less happy?
Mm.
What if having an abundance of choices, far from being this pathway to fulfillment, ironically leads to feelings of misery or anxiety or even just outright paralysis?
That's the paradox.
That's the core paradox we're diving deep into today.
Yeah.
Our exploration is really firmly rooted in a pretty seminal piece of research, Doing Better But Feeling Worse, The Paradox of Choice, by Barry Schwartz and Andrew Ward. It was a foundational chapter published in Positive Psychology and Practice.
A very influential piece.
Absolutely. We've meticulously extracted the crucial insights and, frankly, some fascinating studies from their work to really shine a light on this often overlooked yet incredibly pervasive aspect of modern life.
It affects everyone.
It really
Yeah.
does. So our mission today is to truly unpack this perplexing paradox. We want to uncover the profound psychological reasons why something that seems like a blessing can end up feeling like such a burden.
And important.
And most importantly, to equip you, our listeners, with actionable, research-informed strategies to navigate this, let's face it, overwhelming landscape of choice more effectively for your own personal well-being.
Practical takeaways.
Exactly. So let's peel back the layers on this paradox of choice and understand what happens when good things become, well, a little too much.
It's a truly critical topic for our time, I think. Because, as this source profoundly highlights, we are living in an era where choice has simply exploded. It's not just in one or two areas anymore.
No, it's
It's across every single domain imaginable. It's no longer merely about picking a product off a shelf. It's about actively constructing our entire lives, our identities, our relationships, even our health decisions.
Yeah.
And this fundamental shift has deeply significant implications for our psychological state, for better, or, as we'll see, often, unfortunately, for worse.
Okay, so before we dive into the surprising downsides, let's really take a moment to acknowledge why choice is so deeply ingrained in our cultural values. It's almost axiomatic, isn't it?
It really is. Foundational.
Especially here in the United States. And you see it in other Western societies, too. Freedom and autonomy, they aren't just important concepts, they feel paramount. They're valued above almost everything else.
Right.
And we've somehow come to see expanded opportunities for self-determination as a direct measure of individual psychological well-being. And even, frankly, the moral health of the culture itself.
It's tied together.
It's almost this universally accepted truth. Choice is good, and more choice is better. It's kind of an unquestioned belief system.
It truly is. And the philosophical underpinnings for this deep-seated belief, they trace back centuries. You go back to ancient thinkers like Plato.
Wow, really? That far back?
Yeah. Western thought has consistently placed an incredibly high premium on autonomy. The core idea is that choice empowers us. It enables us to control our own destinies, to navigate our lives in a way that gets us precisely what we want, or at least closer to it, from any given situation.
Sure.
It's perceived as absolutely fundamental for healthy individuals who not only want, but, the thinking goes, genuinely need to direct their own lives. Without the ability to choose, the feeling is one of being stifled or controlled, unable to genuinely express your unique self.
Right, that makes sense. And it's not just this kind of grand philosophical ideal, is it? There's a powerful dual value to choice that makes it incredibly appealing in a very practical sense, too. What's the first of those values they talk about?
Well, the first, and it's a really powerful aspect, is its instrumental value. The core insight here is that choice has immense instrumental value because it's essentially the ultimate tool for personalization.
Ah, personalization. Okay.
Right. It allows us to pursue our highly individualized needs in a world that's just not built for one size fits all. Think about it. While basic human needs like food, shelter, maybe fundamental medical care are universal,
Sure.
Much of what allows us to truly flourish beyond those basics is uniquely personal. Your needs, my needs, they differ.
Right.
Choice is precisely what enables each person to select exactly what best satisfies their own specific preferences within the constraints of their resources, of course.
Mm.
So if choice is restricted in any significant way, someone, somewhere, is almost invariably going to be deprived of something that's personally valuable to them. You simply can't force a deeply personal desire into some kind of standardized solution.
That makes perfect sense. We are all distinct individuals, right?
Huh.
And choice is what allows us to truly customize our lives to fit who we are. But you mentioned a second value, one that perhaps goes beyond just the purely practical side of things.
Yes, absolutely. Beyond the practical benefits, choice carries an incredibly powerful expressive value.
Expressive value, how so?
Well, it's essentially how we tell the world who we are and what we care about. Think about it. Every single choice we make,
Yeah.
from the clothes we put on in the morning to the career path we pursue, even the music we listen to, it becomes a kind of testament to our autonomy.
Like a little state.
Exactly. It's an opportunity, big or small, to display our character, our values, our preferences, our very identity. It's actually quite challenging to imagine modern social life as we know it without this deep cultural commitment to individual autonomy and the freedom to express it through the multitude of choices we make every day.
Mm.
It's just so deeply woven into the fabric of who we believe ourselves to be as modern individuals.
So, okay. If choice is so fundamental, so deeply tied to our very well-being and our identity, it really seems like it should only ever be a positive force in our lives.
Logically, yes.
But as we're about to discover, the very explosion of these good things, these choices, can paradoxically become a profound burden. And this is where the paradox actually begins to appear,
Yep.
where the good starts to feel, well, like too much.
That's precisely the pivot point in their argument. While some amount of choice is undeniably good, even necessary for well-being,
Right.
the central argument of our source material is that more choice isn't always better. In fact, it can become excessive, leading to what they powerfully term a misery-inducing tyranny.
Wow. Misery-inducing tyranny. That's strong language. And what really struck me from the source is how they emphasize the sheer scale of this increase. It's not just a little more choice in our lives, it's described as an absolute avalanche.
Mm-hmm. It really is.
The authors argue that modernity has provided this explosion of choice in two distinct yet interconnected ways. First, there are simply more options in areas where people already had choices.
Like consumer goods.
Exactly. And second, we're now facing entirely new choices in domains that were previously quite restrictive, where we barely had any say at all before.
That's right. And the examples the source provides are incredibly vivid. They really make this explosion of choice almost tangible,
Yeah, paint us a picture. Let's start with those familiar domains.
Okay, so let's start with familiar domains because that's where many of us first encountered this overwhelm. The typical American supermarket, for instance. It now carries more than 30,000 different items.
30,000.
Yeah, and just to put that into perspective, over 20,000 new products hit those shelves every single year. Think about the amount of novelty and just sheer decision-making that introduces into a simple grocery trip.
That's a staggering number. I mean, just picturing your average grocery list and then trying to imagine that level of expansion across every single item you might want to buy? It's
Yeah.
mind-boggling. What are some of the specific examples they call out?
Oh, they get quite granular, and it's really illuminating. We're talking about things like 85 varieties of crackers.
Yeah, 5 crackers?
Yeah. 285 different types of cookies, 165 juice drinks, 75 iced teas, and then separately, 95 different varieties of chips and pretzels alone.
Just the snacks.
Just the snacks. And beyond food, they point to 61 varieties of suntan oil, 80 different pain relievers, and 40 options just for toothpaste.
40 toothpaste.
And it just keeps going.
Huh.
360 types of shampoo,
Yeah.
conditioner, gel, and mousse in the hair care aisle.
360.
90 cold remedies, 230 different soups, and specifically, get this, 29 different chicken soups.
29 chicken soups. Why?
Right. You'll find 120 pasta sauces, and then a mind-boggling 175 different salad dressings.
Okay, that's just silly.
And if none of those 175 suit your specific taste, the store still offers 15 distinct extra virgin olive oils and 42 vinegars for you to craft your very own dressing.
And that's probably before you even get to the cereal aisle, which I've heard has upwards of like 275 varieties. It's genuinely overwhelming just to hear it listed out like that, let alone to actually stand there and try and pick one.
Exactly. It induces analysis paralysis right there in aisle 5.
But it's not just the supermarket, is it? This applies to other consumer goods, too.
Precisely. Take consumer electronics for another vivid example. Walk into a typical store, and you're faced with maybe 45 different car stereo systems, along with 50 distinct speaker sets that can be paired with them.
Okay.
Then there are 42 different customizable computers. If you're buying a television, you might have 110 different options: HD, flat screens, varying sizes, features, sound quality.
Wow.
For home entertainment, you might be choosing from 30 different VCRs, back when they wrote this, or 50 different DVD players. And for a classic stereo system, maybe 74 tuners, 55 CD players, 32 tape players, and 50 sets of speakers.
Okay, that's a lot of components.
It is. And the source then makes this astonishing calculation. If you were to mix and match just those stereo components in every conceivable way, you could create a mind-boggling 6,512,000 different stereo systems.
6.5 million different stereo systems. I mean, I didn't even know that many combinations were possible. That's not just more choice. That's an almost infinite landscape of decision-making, where the idea of finding the best one seems utterly impossible.
Utterly daunting. And this isn't just about familiar products either. The explosion of choice has permeated entirely new domains of life, areas that once offered little to no choice at all, forcing us to make decisions we never had to consider before.
Like what?
Think about telephone service. Just a generation ago, it was a regulated monopoly. AT&T, basically.
Right, Mambel.
Exactly. You had one provider, one basic service. There were essentially no choices to be made. With the breakup of that monopoly, we now have this dizzying array of options: different long-distance providers, various calling plans, competing local service providers, and then, of course, the advent of cell phones. Multiply those options yet again with countless carriers, devices, plans.
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly, what was once a total non-decision became a significant, often really complex decision to weigh and contemplate.
I certainly remember when getting a phone was just getting a phone.
Yeah.
That was it. Now you practically need to be a telecommunications expert just to pick a plan that won't bankrupt you or lock you in forever.
Totally.
What other major life domains have seen this kind of profound shift towards more choice?
Retirement pensions are another incredibly powerful example they give. More and more employers have shifted from defined benefit plans, where you get a set amount, to defined contribution plans.
Like 401k.
Exactly. This means that instead of a guaranteed payout, what you receive at retirement depends entirely on how your investments perform. You bear the risk and the choice.
Okay.
And the source provides this incredible, almost unbelievable example. A relative of one of the authors, a partner in a mid-sized accounting firm, previously offered its employees a fairly manageable 14 pension options.
14 sounds reasonable.
Right. Just last year, at the time they wrote this, they expanded that to an astonishing 156 options.
156.
Yes. With the 156th option being the ability for employees to simply design their own.
Design your own pension plan. That's next-level choice right there.
That is-
It requires serious financial expertise. The sheer cognitive load for an average person trying to navigate that must be immense.
Immense, absolutely. Medical care has also seen a huge, albeit maybe more complex, shift. Responsibility for treatment decisions has increasingly landed squarely on the shoulders of patients.
Right, it used to be the doctor just told you what to do.
Exactly. It's moved from that paternalistic model to doctors laying out all the possibilities, explaining the pros and cons, the risks, the benefits, and then you ultimately making the choice.
Which sounds good in theory.
Well, and while this shift has undeniably improved the quality of care in many ways by empowering patients, one physician, cited in the source, Dr. Atul Gawande, reports that research shows this profound paradox.
Okay.
While 65% of people surveyed say they would want to choose their own cancer treatment if they had cancer.
Yeah, you'd think most people would.
Right. But only 12% of those who actually get cancer want to do so when faced with the reality of that decision.
Only 12%. Wow.
Many, in fact, prefer others, doctors, family, to decide for them when confronted with the immense weight and complexity of such life-altering decisions.
That's a stark, almost heartbreaking difference between what people think they want in terms of choice and what they actually choose when the stakes are incredibly high. It really highlights the sheer burden that too much choice can become in certain contexts.
Absolutely. And this extends even to our physical selves. The ability to choose our appearance has expanded dramatically. Cosmetic surgery, once a kind of hushed and niche topic.
Yeah, only for movie stars or something.
Right. It has become a surprisingly commonplace tool for self-improvement. In 1999 alone, the source notes, Over 1 million cosmetic surgical procedures were performed on Americans.
A million.
Yeah, this included 230,000 liposuctions, 165,000 breast augmentations, and 73,000 facelifts. The option to fundamentally transform your body is now widely accessible, presenting yet another profound set of choices for people to make about their very identity and self-perception.
And it's not just our bodies, right? Our work lives have been fundamentally reshaped by this deluge of choice as well, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. The telecommunications revolution, for example, has created enormous flexibility, but also enormous decision-making demands. Many people now face constant choices about when and even where to work.
The work from home dilemma.
Exactly. With email just a modem away, or now constantly in your pocket, the line between work and leisure blurs almost entirely, forcing continuous choices about boundaries, about checking in, about being on. And it's not just how we work, but who we work for. The source mentions the increasingly peripatetic American workforce, meaning people are constantly moving and changing jobs.
Job hopping.
Yeah. The average 32-year-old at the time of writing had already worked for 9 different companies. In 1999, 17 million Americans voluntarily left their jobs to seek other employment. Job hopping, once pretty rare, is now almost a norm, meaning constant, often stressful career choices have to be made.
That makes me think about how our personal relationships have also transformed. The sort of default choices of the past, like getting married, having kids, those seem to have dissolved, leaving just a vast array of possibilities.
Exactly. When it comes to how we love, how we form relationships, a range of life choices has always been technically available, sure. But in the past, the societal default options, marriage, children, traditional family structures, were so powerful that few people felt they were truly making a choice. It was just what you did.
Right, the expected path.
Those who departed from that pattern were often seen as social renegades,
Yeah.
facing significant stigma. These days, the source notes, it's honestly hard to figure out what kind of romantic choice would warrant that kind of attention because we see almost every imaginable arrangement of intimate relations.
Yeah, pretty much anything goes now.
While some unorthodox choices still face disapproval, sure, the general trend is toward ever greater tolerance of romantic diversity. More options, more freedom, yes, but also significantly more decisions to make about one of the most fundamental and emotionally charged aspects of human life.
And finally, this incredible explosion of choice extends to something as profound as our very identity. It's almost as if we're constantly designing ourselves from scratch these days.
That's a powerful way to put it, and I think it's accurate. Modern society offers an unprecedented freedom to literally choose our identities. In the past, people largely came into the world with inherited baggage, right?
Yeah, your family or class.
Your race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, social and economic class, these largely defined who you were and how you were perceived. Not anymore, or at least not nearly as much. Greater possibilities exist for transcending inherited class.
Okay.
Furthermore, most individuals today possess multiple identities and can choose to highlight different ones in different contexts. The source gives a striking example. A young New York immigrant woman from Mexico in a college class. She's deciding whether to express her identity primarily as the Latina, the Mexican, the woman, the immigrant, or the teenager.
Wow, all those facets.
Exactly. Identity is now much less inherited and much more chosen. A constant negotiation, constant performance.
So with this truly staggering explosion of options across almost every facet of our lives, from, serial and stereos to our careers, our love lives, our very identities, it seems only logical that we should be happier, more fulfilled, more aligned with our true selves.
It seems logical.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the data, as you alluded to earlier, tells a far more nuanced and frankly pretty unsettling story. Okay, so despite the simple intuitive logic that increased choice must equal improved well-being, the data, surprisingly, tells a deeply unsettling story. What does it show?
It truly does. Social scientists traditionally operated under this basic assumption that adding more options could only make society better off.
Right, how could it hurt?
Exactly. The reasoning is straightforward. Those who wanted the new options would benefit, and those who didn't could simply ignore them without any consequence. It seemed like a win-win, or at worst, a win-neutral.
Makes sense.
However, empirically, this assumption just isn't holding up. Assessments of well-being are actually quite clear.
Yeah.
In the very period where we've seen this dramatic increase in choice and overall affluence in Western societies,
Yeah.
we've also witnessed a measurable decrease in reported well-being. Fewer people today judge themselves to be happy than in previous generations with far fewer choices.
Fewer people are happy, despite having more.
Fewer people report being happy, yes. And, even more crucially, the incidence of clinical depression and attempted suicide has increased dramatically in this exact same period. Researchers like Diener, Lane, Myers, Eckersley, major figures in well-being research, have all pointed to these deeply troubling counterintuitive trends.
That's such a stark contrast to what we'd instinctively expect from a society with so much more freedom and so many more opportunities. It feels completely backwards. So if infinite choice isn't the key to happiness, what did these assessments identify as the most significant factor?
What assessments of well-being consistently pinpoint as the single most important factor in providing deep, sustained happiness is close social relations.
Social connection.
Yes. People who are married, people who have good friends, people who are deeply connected to their families, they consistently report significantly higher levels of happiness and satisfaction than those who are more isolated or disconnected.
And this is where the paradox really hits hard, doesn't it? Because social ties, in so many fundamental ways, actually decrease freedom, choice, and autonomy.
Precisely. Think about marriage, for example. It's an intense, ideally lifelong commitment to a particular person that fundamentally curtails your freedom of choice regarding sexual and even emotional partners if you take the commitment seriously.
Right.
To be someone's true friend involves weighty responsibilities and obligations that at times inevitably limit your personal freedom. You make sacrifices for your friends.
Yeah, you can't always just do whatever you want.
Exactly. So, counterintuitive as it may appear, what seems to contribute most profoundly to happiness actually binds people rather than liberating them in the sense of maximizing individual freedom. It really challenges our fundamental assumptions about what freedom truly means for well-being.
That's a profoundly insightful observation. And to back this up with direct empirical evidence, the source points to specific research that demonstrates how increased choice can actually be, well, demotivating, leading to less action rather than more.
Exactly. This was powerfully shown in a series of now classic studies by researchers Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper back in 2000.
Okay, tell us about the famous JAM study. It's become such a classic illustration of this perplexing phenomenon, hasn't it?
It really has. It's cited everywhere. This study was elegantly designed and set up right in a gourmet food store. Researchers created a display featuring a line of exotic, high-quality jams.
Fancy jam.
Fancy jam. Customers could taste samples, and if they chose to purchase, they'd receive a $1 off coupon. So there was an incentive. In one condition, the display offered 6 varieties for tasting. In another condition, there were 24 varieties. Importantly, in both cases, the full 24 varieties were available for purchase if a customer asked, so availability wasn't the issue.
Got it. 6 versus 24 options presented initially.
Exactly. The results were truly fascinating. The large array, the one with 24 varieties, it actually attracted more people to the tasting table initially.
Which makes sense, right? More visual appeal, more curiosity.
Right, more to see, more to try. However, when it came to the ultimate action, the actual purchasing, a remarkable 30% of people exposed to the small array, the 6 varieties, ended up buying a jar.
30%, okay.
But only a mere 3% of those exposed to the large array, the 24 varieties, did so.
3% from 24 options.
3%. That's a 10-fold difference in actual purchase rates.
A 10-fold difference in purchase rates. Wow. So more choice got more initial attention, more lookers, but then led to significantly fewer actual buyers. That is genuinely counterintuitive and pretty startling.
Did they manage to replicate this effect in a more controlled laboratory setting?
Yes, they did, to ensure it wasn't just something quirky about jams or grocery stores. In a second study, this time conducted in a laboratory, college students were asked to evaluate gourmet chocolates.
Okay, chocolate, even better.
Right. They then chose one based on description and appearance. They tasted it and rated it, and finally they were offered either a small box of those chocolates or cash as payment for their participation in the study.
Ah, so a choice of reward, too.
Yes. One group faced an initial array of 6 chocolates to choose from for tasting. The other group faced 30 chocolates.
6 versus 30 again.
Exactly. The key results were clear. Students faced with a small array, the 6 chocolates, were more satisfied with their tasting experience overall. They rated the chocolate they chose more highly.
More satisfied with fewer options.
Okay.
And perhaps even more strikingly, they were 4 times as likely to choose the chocolate box as compensation rather than the cash, compared to those who saw the large array of 30.
4 times more likely to take the chocolate?
Yeah. It suggests the enjoyment of the experience itself, The satisfaction with their choice was significantly higher when they had fewer initial options to grapple with.
Wow.
These results are, as you said, profoundly counterintuitive. You would logically think that having more options, whether it's 24 jams or 30 chocolates, would significantly increase your chances of finding something you truly liked, compared to just 6.
Yeah, seems obvious.
Right. At worst, the extra options should just be neutral. They shouldn't take anything away. Surely you're free to simply ignore as many options as you want, right? Just focus on a few.
That's what I would think.
But apparently, people find it remarkably difficult to do so. This powerfully sets the stage for understanding the psychological burden that an overabundance of choice imposes. It's not just overwhelming, it seems it actively diminishes our satisfaction and even our likelihood to make a choice in the first place.
So if more choice doesn't consistently make us happier and can even demotivate us from making a decision at all, it begs a crucial question. What kind of choosers are we fundamentally? And how do our individual styles, or personalities perhaps, play into this paradox of choice? To really understand this, we need to go back over half a century, actually, to the foundational work of Nobel laureate Herbert Simon. In the 1950s, Simon proposed that in many choice situations, individuals don't actually try to find the absolute best possible option. Instead, he said they satisfice. What exactly did he mean by that term, satisfice?
It's a great term, a blend of satisfy and suffice. Essentially, a satisficer is someone who operates on a principle of good enough. They choose the very first option they encounter that meets their absolute threshold of acceptability.
Okay, a minimum standard.
Exactly. They're not necessarily looking for the absolute best thing out there. They're aiming for a perfectly viable option that fulfills their core needs or criteria. And this strategy, Simon argued, makes the otherwise potentially overwhelming task of evaluating endless options far more manageable.
Right.
They simply end their search once a suitable option is found. This saves immense amounts of time, energy, and, importantly, cognitive effort.
So the satisficer's internal monologue might be something like, okay, this one works, it meets my needs, great, I'm done, and I'm moving on with my life.
Pretty much, yeah. Less angst.
But the opposite of that, which I think many of us might relate to, especially in today's world of seemingly infinite options, is what Schwartz and his colleagues call maximizing.
Precisely. Maximizing refers to this deeply ingrained tendency, or maybe even a drive, to seek the very best option available in any given choice domain. You want the optimal outcome.
The absolute peak.
Yes. And the source argues that with the sheer increase in choices available today, the internal pressure, and sometimes external pressure too, to maximize, can intensify dramatically. This leads to significantly more cognitive effort, much more prolonged comparison between options, and that constant nagging worry of making a wrong or suboptimal choice.
The fear of missing out, FOMO, essentially.
Very much related, yes. If you're a maximizer, the more choices you face, the greater the potential to experience deep regret later on, having chosen something that wasn't, in the end, absolutely perfect or the very best you could have possibly gotten.
And the authors of our source, Schwartz and his colleagues, actually conducted significant research back in 2002 to systematically identify these two types of choosers. They designed something they called a maximization scale. Can you walk us through what that involved? How did they measure this?
Certainly. They developed a 13-item survey, a questionnaire specifically designed to differentiate between people who tend towards maximizing and those who tend towards satisficing. Respondents are asked to rate how much they agree or disagree with statements that reflect certain tendencies.
Like what kind of statements?
Well, some reflect having really high standards, for example. No matter what I do, I have the highest standards for myself. Others reflect actions consistent with maximizing behavior, like, when I'm in the car listening to the radio, I often check other stations to see if something better is playing, even if I'm relatively satisfied with what I'm listening to.
Ah, the channel surfer maximizer. I know that feeling.
Right. Or statements reflecting behaviors aimed at finding the best, such as, renting videos is really difficult. I'm always struggling to pick the best one. Remember renting videos?
Vaguely. But the principle applies to streaming now, for sure. Okay, so they were really trying to capture both that internal drive and the outward behavioral manifestation of maximizing. What did they find when they administered this survey to over 1,700 participants? They had a pretty diverse group, right?
Yes, very diverse, ranging widely in age, ethnicity, educational background, income. And the findings were quite illuminating and, frankly, for people who scored high on maximization, rather sobering.
How so?
Well, in terms of self-reported happiness, maximizers, those who scored high on the scale, reported being significantly less happy and also less optimistic about the future than satisficers, those who scored low. They also consistently reported lower scores on various measures of subjective well-being across the board.
Less happy, less optimistic, lower well-being. That's already quite telling. What about mental health indicators like depression?
The link to depression was particularly striking and honestly concerning. In one subsample they looked at, a substantial 44% of individuals whose depression scores met the diagnostic criterion for mild depression also scored in the top quartile for maximization.
Almost half of those with mild depression symptoms were high maximizers.
Yes, whereas only 16% of those who met that same depression criterion scored in the bottom quartile, meaning they were strong satisficers.
Wow. That indicates a very strong, almost alarming correlation between a maximizing tendency and depressive symptoms.
It really does. Maximizers also reported lower self-esteem scores. Interestingly, while there was some correlation found with neuroticism, general negative emotionality, it did not reach statistical significance. This suggests that maximization is likely a distinct psychological construct, not just another symptom of general anxiety or distress.
That's an important nuance, differentiating it from just being, say, an anxious personality type. What about perfectionism? That might seem similar to maximizing, striving for the absolute best. How did that relate?
That's a great question, and it's a critical distinction this study makes. While perfectionism and maximizing might seem related on the surface, both involve high standards. The study found that perfectionist tendencies actually correlated positively with happiness in their sample, unlike maximizing.
Perfectionism correlated with more happiness. That's surprising.
It is, isn't it? But it suggests that simply striving for high standards, or even a degree of perfection you define for yourself, isn't necessarily detrimental or linked to unhappiness. It seems to be the relentless, often exhausting pursuit of the absolute best possible option out there. Across limitless choices, that constant comparison, the endless search, the inability to settle, that seems to be the key factor driving unhappiness and regret for maximizers.
So perfectionism might be about achieving a high internal standard, while maximizing is about finding the highest possible external standard, which is often a moving target and depends on comparison.
That's a really good way to put it, yes. And finally, a key finding that powerfully ties into this. Those who scored high on the maximization scale were much, much more likely to report experiencing regret in their lives.
Regret again.
Yes. Statistical analysis showed that this tendency to experience regret actually partially mediated many of the relationships they found between maximizing and negative psychological outcomes. For example, being less happy or more depressed.
The regret isn't just a side effect, it's potentially a core mechanism linking maximizing to feeling bad.
It suggests exactly that. Regret seems to be a central piece of the psychological burden that maximizers carry around with them.
So it's not just that maximizers feel bad, their very behavior seems almost designed perhaps to avoid future regret, even if that means making more conservative choices or agonizing more now. Did they test this behaviorally in an experiment?
They did, and it's quite a clever setup. In a subsequent study, they used a modified version of the classic ultimatum game.
Okay, remind us how that works.
In the standard setup, one participant, the proposer, suggests how to divide a sum of money, say $10, with a second participant, the responder. If the responder accepts the offer, the money is divided as proposed. If the responder rejects it, neither player gets anything.
Right, so the proposer has to offer something the responder will accept.
Exactly. In the modified version used in this research, however, the proposer is expected to learn the second player's reservation price. After the fact, that's the minimum acceptable offer the second player would have actually taken.
So you might find out you offered $5 when they would have accepted $2.
Precisely. This created a greater potential for anticipated regret, as the proposer might realize they had been too generous if the reservation price turned out to be lower than their offer. They could have kept more money for themselves.
Okay, so how did maximizers and satisficers behave differently here?
As predicted, in this modified version where they anticipated potential regret, the maximizers made much more modest offers to their opponents. They offered less money.
Trying to avoid that feeling of having given away too much?
Exactly. They were trying to avoid the anticipated regret of having been overly generous. Satisficers, however, did not show this pattern. Their offers remained pretty consistent whether they expected to learn the reservation price or not.
Interesting.
This strongly suggests that maximizers' decision-making behavior is significantly influenced by this desire to minimize future regret, even when that regret is only an abstract possibility about a few dollars in the game.
And what about social comparison? We touched on this, but are maximizers inherently more prone to that constant keeping up with the Joneses kind of thinking? Do they compare themselves more?
Absolutely. That was a core hypothesis.
Yeah.
The idea was that maximizers are inherently more likely to engage in social comparison, especially upward comparison. That's comparing themselves to someone who is seemingly better off or has achieved a better outcome.
Why upward comparison specifically?
Because, the thinking goes, this provides them with constant evidence that they haven't yet achieved an optimal outcome themselves. There's always someone out there with something more or better, reinforcing their feeling that their own choice wasn't the absolute best.
Okay. How did they test this?
They explored this in 2 studies. In the first, using surveys, maximizers reported engaging in more frequent social comparison overall, both comparing upwards and downwards. But crucially, it was their greater frequency of upward comparison that was significantly associated with increased unhappiness.
So comparing yourself to people worse off didn't make them happier, but comparing to people better off definitely made them unhappier.
Precisely. They also sought more social comparison information when making consumer decisions. They engaged in more product comparisons between what they bought and what others bought. And, importantly, they engaged in more counterfactual thinking. That's thinking about the alternatives they didn't choose, all leading to heightened regret and diminished happiness with their actual purchases.
So they're not just looking for the best in some abstract sense. They're constantly looking at what others have that might be better than what they chose or currently possess. It just sounds exhausting.
It really does. The second study used a more controlled laboratory setting. Participants performed an anagram-solving task while sitting next to a confederate, someone secretly working with the researchers, who performed either much slower or much faster than the actual participant.
Okay, setting up a direct comparison.
Exactly. The results were stark. Maximizers were heavily affected by their peers' performance, especially when they were outperformed. Their self-assessment of their own ability and their positive feelings plummeted significantly in that scenario.
Wow, just seeing someone else do better really hit them hard.
Yeah. Satisficers, by contrast, were barely affected by the other participants' performance, whether the confederate did better or worse. Their mood and their self-assessment remained largely stable regardless of the comparison.
They were more internally referenced.
Exactly. So, in sum, across both survey methods and experimental procedures, the evidence seems pretty conclusive. Maximizers consistently showed themselves to be less happy and more depressed than satisficers. They are more prone to regret, both experienced and anticipated, and they engage in more social comparison, particularly that detrimental upward comparison. In their relentless, often self-defeating quest for the best option, they appear to significantly increase their own unhappiness and end up regretting their choices more. For them, it seems, the best is truly far from ideal when it comes to psychological well-being.
It's really clear that the maximizer mindset, particularly when dropped into a world overflowing with options, can be a recipe for profound unhappiness. But why exactly does more choice lead to this suffering? It can't just be about being a maximizer versus a satisficer, can it? There must be underlying psychological mechanisms that make this paradox so potent for everyone, even if maximizers feel it more intensely. Let's dive into those now.
Okay, now let's really peel back the layers and try to understand the specific psychological factors that seem to conspire to undermine the objective benefits that intuitively should come with having increased choice. Why does it hurt sometimes?
It's a critical question. And as we just discussed, it's important to remember that all of these psychological problems are often greatly exacerbated for maximizers, but they really affect all of us to varying degrees in this high-choice environment.
Right.
So let's start with the first and perhaps the most pervasive and painful mechanism. 1, regret, both post-decision and anticipated.
We keep coming back to regret because it's central. The core impact here, as shown in the research, is that regret acts as a major mediator between maximizing tendencies and overall life satisfaction. People who consistently report high levels of regret are measurably less happy. They're less satisfied with life in general, they're less optimistic about their future, and they're more prone to depression. And as I just learned, maximizers disproportionately experience this high level of regret.
Okay, so break down the 2 types again.
Sure. First, there's post-decision regret, which is often colloquially called buyer's remorse. This is that nagging, bitter feeling after you've made a choice that the rejected alternatives were actually better than the one you chose. Or maybe that there were superior options out there you haven't even explored yet, and you missed them.
That what-if feeling.
Exactly. The bitter taste of this regret simply detracts from your satisfaction with what you did choose. Whether that regret is objectively justified or not, is that persistent feeling that I could have done better.
Ugh, yeah. Painful. And the other type,
The other type, anticipated regret, can be even more insidious because it often leads to outright paralysis, not making a choice at all. This is the fear that if you make a choice now, a better option will appear later, or you'll somehow realize you made the wrong move down the line.
Like waiting for the perfect sale that never comes.
Exactly. Or, the example they give, if someone asks herself how it would feel to buy this particular house only to discover a much better one becomes available next week, she probably won't buy this house today. She'll be frozen by the potential for future regret.
Right.
So both types of regret, the anticipated fear and the post-decision remorse, significantly raise the emotional stakes of making decisions. They make choices far harder to make in the first place, and then once made, much harder to actually enjoy and feel good about.
And what role does that you mentioned earlier, counterfactual thinking, play in fueling all of this regret, that agonizing mental replay?
It plays a huge role. Counterfactual thinking is literally thinking about what might have been, constructing mental simulations of states of affairs that don't actually exist in reality.
Daydreaming about different outcomes.
Often negative daydreaming, yeah. Counterfactual thoughts are usually triggered by negative emotions like getting a poor exam grade, having relationship trouble, or making a purchase you're unhappy with. And crucially, they often focus on aspects of this situation that are perceived to be under one's own control.
Ah, so it feels like your fault.
Precisely. This direct link to personal agency intensifies the feeling of regret, making you feel more directly responsible for the perceived failure or suboptimal outcome. That internal refrain of, if only I had chosen differently, or if only I had known, becomes constant and self-blaming.
Okay, so how does having more choice specifically exacerbate this whole regret cycle?
Well, think about the spectrum. When there are virtually no options, you might experience disappointment if the outcome is bad, sure, but not true regret, because you feel you couldn't have done otherwise. Circumstances dictated it.
Right, nothing to regret if there was no choice.
When you have only a few options, you might feel you did your best, but circumstances still limited you somewhat. You might think, well, among those three, this was the best I could do.
Okay.
However, when you have many, many options, the perceived chances increase dramatically that a really good one, maybe even a perfect one, is out there somewhere, and you feel personally responsible for finding it. It's on you.
The burden of finding the needle in the haystack?
Exactly. So when your actual choice disappoints, even slightly, you immediately regret not having chosen more wisely, not having searched harder or longer. And as the number of options proliferates to truly overwhelming levels, exhaustive investigation becomes literally impossible, which paradoxically leads to anticipated regret, the fear that you will choose wrong that could prevent you from making a decision at all.
It's a catch-22.
It really is. Landman, a prominent researcher on regret, sums it up chillingly in a quote the source uses.
Wow.
Ironically then, the greater the number of appealing choices, the greater the opportunity for regret.
Wow. More appealing choices means more potential regret. That's harsh.
And just to reiterate this point one more time, for maximizers, regret looms largest because their internal standard is perfection itself. For them, perfection is the only weapon against regret, which leads to that endless, exhaustive, paralyzing consideration of the alternatives. Satisficers, by contrast, just have much lower stakes because perfection simply isn't their goal. Good enough shields them from a lot of this angst.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so regret is a huge factor. On to the next psychological mechanism, too. Opportunity costs. This is a term many of us might know from economics, but how does it relate to our satisfaction with our choices in this psychological context?
Right, in economics, the opportunity cost is formally defined as one of the costs of any option involves passing up the opportunities that a different option would have afforded. It's typically considered the value of the single next best alternative that you didn't choose.
So simply put, when you choose option A, the benefits you implicitly miss out on from not choosing option B are your opportunity cost. It's the value of the road not taken.
Exactly. That's the basic idea. The challenge in reality, psychologically speaking, is that options usually have multiple complex features. It's incredibly hard to identify a single next best overall alternative. Different options might excel on different individual features, making a clear, simple comparison almost impossible.
Like, one car has better gas mileage, but another has more features and a third looks cooler.
Precisely. So the psychological argument here is that if we assume that we mentally feel, or at least consider, the opportunity costs associated with many, or perhaps even all, of the attractive rejected options.
Not just the single next best one.
Right. If we feel the sting of missing out on the good features of multiple rejected options, then the more alternatives there are, the greater our cumulative experience of these opportunity costs will be.
Yeah.
And the net effect is that this subtracts from our overall satisfaction. The less satisfaction we ultimately derive from our chosen alternative because we're so aware of what we gave up.
It's like a mental subtraction process where every other nice option diminishes the perceived value of the one you actually selected.
That's a good way to think about it. And the source mentions an illustrative study by Brenner, Rottenstreich, and Sood from 1999. They found that people valued subscriptions to magazines or videotapes more when they evaluated them in isolation than when they evaluated them as part of a group of other appealing subscriptions.
Why is that?
Because, the researchers argue, when evaluated in a group setting, the appealing features of the other options created opportunity costs that reduced the perceived value of each individual option. You start thinking, well, this magazine's good, but that other one covers X, Y, and Z, which this one doesn't. The comparison diminishes the appeal.
That's a great illustration. It's like picking a delicious flavor of ice cream, but then constantly seeing all the other amazing flavors available in the case and feeling like you somehow missed out on something even better rather than just enjoying the perfectly good scoop that's right there in your cone.
Exactly that feeling.
Okay, next up is mechanism number 3. 3, effects of adaptation. This is about our capacity for pleasure and displeasure changing over time, right? The hedonic treadmill idea.
Exactly. This refers to how our hedonic thermometers, our internal capacity for experiencing pleasure and displeasure, tend to adapt over time. Repeated exposure to positive experiences generally results in a diminished emotional response. The initial thrill, the joy, it wears off.
Right. The famous Brickman, Coates, and Jonoff-Bullman study from 1978 is a classic example of this, isn't it? They looked at lottery winners and accident victims.
Yes, a landmark study. They found that lottery winners, while initially ecstatic, of course, were generally no happier than the general population a year or so later. They had adapted to their new wealth.
Amazing.
Conversely, accident victims who became paraplegic or quadriplegic, while naturally less happy than before their accidents, still judged themselves to be happy overall and found joy in everyday life, much more so than non-disabled people predicted they would. They adapted to their new circumstances, too.
It powerfully demonstrates our incredible human capacity to adapt, both to incredibly good fortune and to terrible tragedy.
It does. And the psychological problem here, according to the source, is that people generally don't anticipate this adaptation very well. We tend to overestimate how long positive feelings will last, which inevitably leads to disappointment when the initial buzz fades.
We expect the honeymoon phase to last forever.
Kind of, yeah. And this disappointment, this fading of pleasure, then drives people to constantly pursue novelty, to seek out new experiences and purchases, leading to what Brickman and Campbell famously called the hedonic treadmill, where we're constantly running to find new pleasures whose intensity hasn't yet dissipated, but inevitably will.
Always chasing the next high.
And even more insidious, perhaps, is what Daniel Kahneman calls the satisfaction treadmill, where we adapt not just to specific experiences, but to particular levels of satisfaction. So what once thrilled us and felt like a peak experience becomes our new baseline, our new normal. We need something even better next time just to feel the same level of satisfaction.
Okay, so how does this adaptation specifically relate back to the paradox of choice?
The relevance is this. Think about the search costs of making a decision. The time, the effort, the anxiety, which remember are especially high for maximizers when choice is overwhelming. If those costs are spread out over a long period of sustained satisfaction from the chosen option, then the costs seem relatively small compared to the long-term benefit.
Right, the effort was worth it.
But if satisfaction is short-lived because we quickly adapt, say, you spend months agonizing over buying the perfect house, you finally buy it, you love it for 2 months, and then you get a job transfer and have to move, then those initial high search costs subtract much more dramatically from your total net satisfaction because you didn't get the long-term enjoyment to amortize them, so to speak. The effort feels disproportionate to the fleeting joy you experienced. Adaptation shortens the payoff period.
That leads directly into the fourth mechanism for high expectations, which seems like a natural consequence of both having so many options and maybe not anticipating adaptation.
Indeed. Our evaluation of any experience is significantly influenced by various comparisons. What we hoped for, what we expected going in, how it compares to our past experiences, and importantly, how it compared to what others have experienced.
Right. Expectations frame everything.
And when you have seemingly infinite choice, the expectation naturally arises that there must be something perfect out there. Why settle for good when the perfect option might exist? This drives expectations sky high.
And as our material and social circumstances generally improve over time in developed societies, our standards of comparison inevitably go up too. It's almost like that curse of discernment. Once you experience truly high quality, whether it's coffee or sound systems or vacations, slightly lower quality items that used to be perfectly acceptable are suddenly just not good enough anymore. You can't easily go back.
Exactly. The hedonic zero point, our baseline for what feels neutral, just keeps rising, and our expectations and aspirations rise right along with it. The result, as the source puts it, is that as long as expectations keep pace with realizations, people may live better, objectively speaking, but they won't feel better about how they live. They just keep chasing that constantly rising bar of expectation.
Living better but not feeling better, that's a core part of the paradox.
It is, and this factor is especially acute for maximizers naturally. They invest the most effort into their decisions, they consider the most options, and therefore they develop the highest expectations about the results. This makes them, as the source says, the most disappointed, when reality, as it almost always does, doesn't quite meet their elevated, often unrealistic standards. The gap between expectation and reality is largest for them.
And as if all those internal battles, regret, opportunity costs, adaptation, high expectations weren't enough to deal with, we then step into the social arena with Fi-Fi. Social comparison, a force that, as we briefly touched upon when discussing maximizers, can relentlessly diminish our satisfaction. Let's delve a bit deeper into how comparing ourselves to others truly hurts in this context.
Right. Comparison to other people is an absolutely paramount source for evaluating our own experiences, our own choices, and ultimately our own self-worth. It's almost an inescapable part of being a social creature.
And it seems like social comparison information is just everywhere now, right? Seemingly all pervasive, as the source says. Especially with social media, we have much less control over seeing what others have or do compared to something like counterfactual thinking, which is more of an internal thought process we might be able to manage better. You can't help but see what others are posting.
Precisely. It's constantly in our faces. And researchers like Sanjil Lubomirsky and her colleagues have consistently shown that dispositionally happy people, people who generally report high levels of happiness, seem to be minimally affected by social comparison information. For example, in those anagram studies we mentioned, happy people were barely affected emotionally by whether a peer performed better or worse than them. Their mood and self-assessment remained pretty stable.
Okay.
In contrast, unhappy people show significant shifts in their assessability and their positive feelings based purely on whether the peer did better or worse. They are much more reactive to the comparison.
And how does this play out for maximizers versus satisficers?
Well, for maximizers, this is particularly problematic.
Yeah.
They are inherently more sensitive to others' behavior and outcomes as a gauge of their own progress in obtaining the best. How do you know you have the best car or job or vacation? Often for a maximizer, it requires comparing yourself to others to see if you actually did get the best relative to your peers.
It's an external benchmark.
Exactly. This makes the maximizer, as the source puts it, a slave in her judgments to the experiences of other people. Their satisfaction is contingent on where they rank. Satisficers, on the other hand, can more readily rely on their own internal assessments of good enough. They don't need to win the comparison game to feel okay about their choice.
Finally, we arrive at what might be the most profound and frankly disturbing psychological mechanism discussed in the source. 6. Learned helplessness, controlled depression, and self-blame. This feels like the culmination of all the other issues we've talked about.
It absolutely does feel that way. It ties many threads together. Referencing Martin Seligman's highly influential theory, clinical depression can often stem from a perceived lack of control over significant life events, a state he termed learned helplessness. The revised theory of learned helplessness suggests that this feeling of helplessness is most likely to lead to depression if the individual attributes their failures or negative outcomes to causes that are seen as global, meaning it affects everything I do, chronic, meaning it's going to last forever, and personal, meaning it's all my fault.
Global, chronic, personal attributions for failure.
Got it. Tests of this revised theory have yielded pretty impressive results over the years. People who attribute failures to chronic causes expect those failures to persist. Those who attribute them to global causes feel like failure follows them everywhere into different domains of life. And those who attribute them to personal causes suffer large losses in self-esteem.
And here's the profound, almost heartbreaking paradox the authors highlight, which you mentioned earlier. The American middle class today experiences an almost unimaginable degree of actual control and personal autonomy due to this explosion of choice in nearly every life domain. Objectively, we have more control than ever. Yet, despite this unprecedented level of control, we've simultaneously seen this explosive growth in clinical depression, attacking victims at a younger and younger age. The source cites a rate of 7.5% before age 14, double the rate from just 10 years prior to their writing. Suicide rates are also tragically on the rise, having tripled among American college students in the 35 years leading up to the publication. Throughout the developed world, suicide among adolescents and young adults is increasing dramatically. So the huge question is, in an era seemingly defined by ever greater personal autonomy and control, what could possibly account for this terrifying degree of personal misery?
It's the central puzzle. The authors offer several compelling potential answers to this profound question, weaving together the threads we've discussed. First, they argue, increases in experienced objective control have been matched, maybe even outpaced, stride for stride, by increases in our expectations about control.
Our expectations have risen even faster than our actual control.
That's the idea. The more we are allowed to be the masters of our fates, the more we expect to be. This relentless cultural emphasis on freedom, choice, autonomy, combined with the seemingly endless possibilities of modern life, fosters increasingly unrealistic expectations about what we should be able to achieve and control in every aspect of our lives.
The expectation becomes perfection.
Yes. And along with this, American culture, and arguably many Western cultures, have also become profoundly more individualistic, partly as a byproduct of this intense desire for control and self-determination. This means people not only expect perfection in all things, but they also increasingly expect to produce this perfection themselves. We're constantly told we can do anything, be anything, and that every outcome is within our grasp if we just make the right choices, put in the effort.
The myth of the entirely self-made person.
Exactly. And this creates a truly lethal combination psychologically. Unrealistically high expectations, coupled with a tendency to take intense, often self-blaming personal responsibility for any perceived failure. When people inevitably fail to achieve this perceived perfection, because perfection is impossible, the culture of individualism biases them towards causal explanations that focus on personal rather than universal factors.
So instead of thinking this is hard or sometimes things don't work out, we think
it must be my fault, I chose wrong, or I didn't try hard enough, or just not good enough. This heavily encourages self-blame.
unrealistically high expectations coupled with the tendency to take intense personal responsibility for failure make a lethal combination. That quote from the source really sums it up.
It does. And this problem, as we've seen throughout this discussion, is especially acute for maximizers. They put the most work into their decisions, they have the highest expectations for the outcomes, and thus they are the most disappointed when their reality inevitably doesn't meet their idealized vision.
Right.
The research shows that strong, positive relation between maximizing and measures of depression. For those individuals scoring highest on the maximization scale, their average depression scores are alarmingly in the borderline clinical range.
That's incredibly concerning.
It is. The authors suggest that when virtually every choice you make fails to live up to expectations and aspirations, and you consistently take intense personal responsibility for the disappointments, then even trivial decisions start to loom larger and larger. It can lead to this devastating, spiraling, self-blaming conclusion that you can't do anything right. It's a pathway toward learned helplessness and depression, ironically fueled by the very culture of choice and control.
Wow. The picture painted here is certainly sobering, maybe even alarming. But the good news, and what makes this research so powerful and practical, is that the authors don't just leave us there, overwhelmed by the problem. They offer practical, research-informed suggestions for actually navigating this tyranny of choice, for finding a way to thrive amidst the deluge. Okay, so after exploring all those psychological pitfalls, how can we, as individuals, proactively mitigate these profound negative effects? How can we truly reclaim satisfaction and well-being in a world that's just overflowing with options? Where do we begin to push back against this tyranny?
It's important to preface these by saying, as the authors do, that these are astute suggestions based logically on the arguments and findings presented in their work, rather than necessarily strategies whose direct impact has been empirically tested as interventions themselves. But they offer a valuable, coherent path forward for individuals feeling overwhelmed.
Okay, practical suggestions grounded in the research. What's the first one?
First, and perhaps most fundamentally, is to 1. Choose when to choose. The core idea here is simple but powerful. Be incredibly selective about where you invest your finite choice energy.
Choice energy, I like that.
Yeah. You need to consciously decide which areas of life choice truly matters most to you, where your values are most deeply engaged, and then focus your limited time and attention there, while consciously, deliberately letting other opportunities, other decisions in less important domains, pass you by without overthinking or agonizing over them.
That makes profound sense, because the perceived benefits of having endless options, more variety, potential for the perfect fit, they're immediate and obvious. But the costs, the regret, the cognitive load, the emotional drain, those are far more subtle and insidious. And importantly, as the source points out, they are cumulative.
Exactly. They add up.
So by consciously limiting the domains where you exert maximum choice effort, where you really try to optimize, you can actually manage the problem of excessive choice before it completely manages and overwhelms you. It's almost like strategic surrender in certain areas.
That's a great way to put it. Strategic surrender. Second, and arguably the most crucial strategy for improving personal well-being in a high-choice world, is to consciously try to satisfice more and maximize less.
Easier said than done, maybe.
Perhaps, but critical nonetheless. As we've seen so clearly from the research, maximizers are the ones who suffer most acutely in a culture that provides too many choices. They're the ones plagued by those unmet expectations, who worry most about regret, missed opportunities, and those relentless social comparisons. They're the most profoundly disappointed when results don't meet their perfect ideal.
Right.
So learning to genuinely accept and even embrace the good enough mindset will dramatically simplify your decision-making process and, crucially, is likely to increase your overall satisfaction with the choices you make. While satisficers might objectively do less well by certain external metrics or standards in some cases.
They might not get the absolute rock bottom price, for example.
Exactly. But the research strongly suggests they will usually feel better about the decisions they make and ultimately feel better about their lives overall. It's a profound shift in mindset, away from external optimization towards internal contentment.
So it's truly about choosing your internal battles, recognizing that the relentless pursuit of perfection often leads to less happiness, not more. Okay, next strategy. 3. Think less about opportunity costs. This seems like it directly counters our natural inclination to weigh pros and cons.
It does feel a bit counterintuitive. And the authors acknowledge that while it's sometimes a good idea to think about the alternatives, you'll pass up when choosing your most preferred option, because ignoring these costs entirely can lead you to overestimate how good your chosen option truly is. The key here is finding a balance.
Okay.
Overthinking opportunity costs, constantly dwelling on the attractive features of all the options you rejected, can significantly diminish the satisfaction you derive from the option you actually did pick. Because, as we discussed, you're constantly performing that mental subtraction of the imagined benefits of the unchosen paths.
Right, focusing on what you're missing.
So the advice is to make a conscious, disciplined effort to limit how much you dwell on the attractive features of the options you ultimately reject. And being a satisficer helps immensely here, naturally, as satisficers tend to rely more on their own internal standards for good enough rather than making endless external comparisons to phantom alternatives.
Right. A satisficer might not get the absolute highest possible return on an investment fund, maybe, but they'll likely be far more satisfied with the perfectly decent return they do get. And they'll have a wealth of more time and mental energy for things that matter more to them, rather than spending hours dwelling on the 0.05% they might have missed out on.
Precisely. It frees up cognitive resources. Fourth strategy is to 4. Practice gratitude.
Gratitude. How does that fit in?
Well, our evaluations of our choices and experiences are profoundly affected by what we compare them with, including the imagined alternatives we conjure up or the expectations we set beforehand. The exact same objective experience can be perceived as both delightful and disappointing, depending entirely on this mental framework, this comparison standard.
Okay.
Which of these frames we choose to focus on largely determines our ultimate satisfaction. So, we can vastly improve our subjective experience of our choices by consciously, actively striving to be grateful more often for what is genuinely good about a choice or an experience we've had, rather than instinctively focusing on the negatives, the disappointments, or the what-ifs.
Focusing on the positive aspects of the chosen option.
Yes, and the research on gratitude suggests that it doesn't always come naturally. We often automatically think about how things could be better when life isn't going perfectly, but we don't always spontaneously think about how things could be worse when things are actually going pretty well.
That's true.
But with consistent, conscious practice, We can learn to reflect more often on how much better things are than they might realistically be, or how good certain aspects are, even if others aren't perfect. And this practice of gratitude will inherently make the good things in life feel even better, feel more satisfying.
Building on that positivity, the fifth strategy is 5, regret less. This feels like a direct call to action against one of the most painful psychological mechanisms we discussed earlier. Less regret sounds great, but how?
It absolutely is a direct call to action. The pervasive sting of regret, whether it's actual post-decision remorse or that paralyzing potential or anticipated regret, it colors so many of our decisions and, as we saw, sometimes influences people to avoid making important decisions altogether.
Right.
Now, the authors acknowledge that a healthy amount of regret can sometimes be appropriate and even instructive. It can act as a learning tool for future choices. But when regret becomes so pronounced that it poisons our satisfaction or prevents us from making decisions in the first place, it needs to be actively mitigated.
So what are the strategies for regretting less?
Well, they tie back to the other points. Primarily, consciously adopting satisficer standards rather than maximizer ones. If your goal is good enough instead of perfect, there's inherently less room for regret. Also, proactively reducing the number of options you even allow yourself to consider upfront can help fewer options mean fewer rejected alternatives to potentially regret later. And finally, consistently practicing gratitude, focusing on what is good about your choice rather than dwelling on its perceived disappointments or the imagined perfection of alternatives. It's about actively breaking that destructive cycle of second-guessing.
Then number 6 is 6, control expectations. This seems like a direct countermeasure to that rising hedonic treadmill and the disappointment gap we talked about earlier.
It is, exactly. Since our ultimate satisfaction with a choice is largely determined by how the actual experience measures up against our prior expectations, one of the most straightforward and effective routes to increasing satisfaction is to actively work to lower excessively high or unrealistic expectations about the results of your decisions.
Manage expectations downwards.
Essentially, yes. Keep them realistic, and this becomes inherently easier if you follow the other advice. Reduce the number of options considered in the first place, which lowers the belief that perfection is attainable, and, once again, fundamentally embrace that satisficing mindset. When good enough is your genuine target, you're far more likely to actually hit it and feel satisfied with the outcome. You haven't set yourself up for disappointment.
Okay. And for those of us, maybe especially maximizers, who are prone to constantly comparing ourselves to others, the 7th strategy is crucial. 7, curtail social comparison. Cut back on looking over our shoulder.
Yes. Although social comparison can sometimes offer useful information, perhaps showing you what's possible in a domain, or maybe even motivating you to improve the overwhelming evidence, suggests it far more frequently diminishes our personal satisfaction with our own lives and choices.
It's mostly a recipe for feeling inadequate.
Often, yes. It's a constant external gauge that, for maximizers especially, pretty much ensures you never feel like you truly have the best, because someone else always seems to have something more or better. By consciously and deliberately reducing how much you compare yourself, your choices, and your outcomes to others, you will likely experience significantly greater contentment with your own circumstances. It allows you to define your own success and satisfaction based on your own values, rather than letting others constantly define your perceived failures or shortcomings through comparison.
Okay, and finally, the 8th strategy. This may be the most counterintuitive one, especially for our modern, choice-obsessed culture. 8, learn to love constraints. What do they mean by that? Love limits.
It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But the argument is this. When the number of choices becomes truly overwhelming, when even routine, everyday decisions start to consume way too much of our precious time and mental attention, the very idea of freedom of choice can actually start to feel like a burden, like the tyranny they described.
Right, freedom becomes exhausting.
Exactly. In these circumstances, the authors suggest we should try to learn to view limits on the possibilities we face, whether they're imposed externally or, importantly, self-imposed as potentially liberating, rather than automatically seeing them as constraining or negative.
So how does that work in practice? How can limits be liberating?
Well, think about rules, standards, and norms that society provides for making choices, or even just the habits that our individual experience creates. By consciously deciding to follow a rule, the example they give is always wear a seatbelt, or maybe never drink more than 2 glasses of wine at a work event, or I only check email twice a day.
Self-imposed rules.
Right. By establishing these kinds of rules or habits, we avoid having to make the same deliberate, effortful decision again and again and again in those recurring situations. This kind of rule following or habit formation frees up valuable time and, crucially, mental attention. That energy can then be devoted to thinking more deeply about the really big choices and decisions, the ones where rules don't apply, the ones that truly matter, where deliberate, conscious choice is essential and valuable.
So constraints in some areas free up resources for others.
Precisely. And this connects powerfully back to that concept from Fred Hirsch in 1976, the tyranny of small decisions. We as individuals tend to say a resounding yes to having more choice in every particular seemingly trivial domain. Give me another toothpaste option, another salad dressing, another phone plan feature. But by constantly doing so, we effectively vote yes on the whole overwhelming package of choices.
We don't see the cumulative effect.
Exactly. And the cumulative result, as the authors of our source powerfully suggest, can be tyranny and misery rather than liberation and satisfaction. We choose more in every little corner of our lives, and collectively it creates this overwhelming, often debilitating burden that diminishes our overall well-being. Learning to strategically embrace constraints can be a way to push back.
These shifts, choosing when to choose, satisficing, managing regret and expectations, limiting social comparison, even loving constraints. They aren't always easy, are they? They often go against deeply ingrained cultural norms that constantly tell us more is always better, and maybe even against our own psychological tendencies.
Absolutely. They require conscious effort and practice.
But they offer a clear, actionable path grounded in this research towards potentially greater well-being and more genuine satisfaction in an otherwise overchosen world. Hashtag tag tag outro.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close today, we've really explored the fascinating and often unsettling paradox of choice. We've seen how our societal drive for endless options, often coupled with that pervasive maximizer mindset, can counterintuitively lead to less happiness, more regret, and increased psychological distress.
A clear disconnect. We peeled back the layers to understand the specific psychological mechanisms at play, from the pervasive sting of regret and the hidden costs of missed opportunities, to the relentless adaptation of our expectations, the constant drain of social comparison, and even that devastating cycle of learned helplessness and self-blame that can arise when we feel solely responsible for making the best choice from an infinite pool.
A complex web of factors.
But crucially, we also armed ourselves, hopefully, with practical, actionable strategies based on the work of Schwartz and Ward strategies like choosing when to choose, consciously embracing good enough, practicing gratitude, controlling expectations, and even learning to love the potentially.
This deep dive truly highlights, I think, that while societal progress inevitably brings more options and perhaps unprecedented freedoms in many ways, true psychological well-being might just lie in better understanding our own psychological limits, and maybe consciously embracing a more discerning, a more selective, rather than an exhaustive approach to the myriad of choices that confront us every day. It's really about choosing wisely, not just choosing more.
That's beautifully put. So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to maybe mull over, something that builds on what we've discussed. Given all we've explored today about the paradox of choice and the particular struggles of maximizers, take a moment to consider what freedom truly means to you. Is it simply the absence of all limits, the maximum number of options possible, or is it perhaps something different? Maybe the mindful ability to choose where and how you engage your will, your energy, allowing for more peace and more genuine satisfaction in the everyday.
A powerful question to reflect on.
So as you go about your week, maybe just observe your own relationship with choice. Notice those moments. Are you instinctively chasing the best, or are you sometimes open to good enough? And perhaps consider what small intentional shift might you make starting today to maybe embrace the liberating power of constraint in some small area and find a bit more satisfaction in your daily decisions.